Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name is Petty Officer First Class Mason Rourke, sonar technician aboard the USS Colorado, a Virginia-class fast-attack submarine. I've spent the last 86 days submerged in the cold silence of the Pacific, surrounded by thick steel and thicker secrets. Our mission had been classified from the start, something about signal interception and observation in the South China Sea. What we picked up near the end, I'm still trying to understand it, but none of it prepared us for what we found when we finally surfaced. We were somewhere off the coast of California, 100 nautical miles west of San Francisco when the orders stopped coming. The Navy doesn't just go dark. Even under the most secure operations, there's protocol. Low-frequency bursts, encrypted sat pings, at least a weekly contact signal. But for 3 weeks we got nothing. Not from Pearl. Not from Northcom. Not even from other boats. At first, Lieutenant Commander Hadley assumed a comms satellite failure. Then he considered jamming or cyber interference. But we all started to realize the truth when even the civilian radio bands stayed silent. No news broadcasts, no chatter, just dead air. "Could be EMP," said Ensign Torres, our communications officer tapping at his console with forced calm. Or some kind of strategic blackout, like during a cyber drill. But we all knew what wasn't being said aloud. The world outside was gone. We started picking up strange signals on passive sonar 3 days before we surfaced. Low-frequency oscillations, long, rhythmic pulses like something from a marine mammal, but not quite. There was a cadence to them, like breath or speech. I ran a few FFTs and matched nothing in our library. Commander Hadley ordered silence running. We dropped to below 500 feet and cut active systems for 36 hours. Not a word, not a ping. Then the signals just stopped. That was when the captain made the call to come up. We were low on fresh produce, batteries were near cycling limits, and morale was fraying. If the satellite uplinks were down and shore command was offline, we had to surface and establish visual confirmation, see with our own eyes what had happened. We breached just after 4 o'clock local time. The Pacific was dead calm. Too calm. I remember staring at the horizon through the sail's periscope and feeling something unnatural in the air. Not storm tension. Not electromagnetic. It was psychological. Like the ocean was holding its breath. We surfaced 20 nautical miles off the Golden Gate, or what was left of it. The San Francisco skyline, normally a constellation of high-rises, port cranes, and city lights, was just jagged shadows against a dull orange haze. There was no power on shore, no aircraft, no Coast Guard, just burned-out ships half sunk in the bay. Cargo containers scattered like children's toys along the Embarcadero. The bridge was broken. One of the towers collapsed into the water like a drowned skeleton. We tried hailing the port of San Francisco, then the Coast Guard, then anyone. No response. "Visual scan complete," said Lieutenant Voss, the officer of the deck. "City appears structurally compromised. Smoke rising from multiple districts. Recommend recon party." "Negative," said Commander Hadley. "No one steps off this boat until I know what's up there, not without respirators and full hazmat." But not everyone agreed. Chief Petty Officer Carver, head of security, argued we couldn't make decisions blind. "Sir, with all due respect, we've got wounded morale, stale rations, and incomplete intel. We need hard data. Satellites offline, sonar's empty. I volunteered to lead a 5-man team to shore. Hadley folded, reluctantly. At 0615, the boarding party was launched via the sealed delivery vehicle stored in the dry deck shelter. Carver, Seaman York, Lieutenant Voss, and 2 sonar techs, Griffin and Kowalski, took sidearms, breathing gear, and 2 handheld Geigers. I watched their dots vanish on the screen as they disappeared into the surf. They returned 6 hours later, but they weren't the same. At first, they looked fine, a little shaken. They said they'd reached what used to be Fisherman's Wharf, but it was mostly burned. They reported that the streets were littered with abandoned vehicles and corpses, mummified, like something had dehydrated them. Buildings showed signs of forced entry and barricading, like people had been fighting. Some had notes scrawled in red on the walls: "Stay. Quiet, don't breathe the air, burn the biters." None of it made sense. No obvious radiation spikes. No visible pathogens. Then Voss collapsed. He started shaking, violently, arms flailing like he was trying to swim through concrete. His eyes rolled back and his body arched. We rushed him to sickbay, thinking it might be some sort of neurotoxin or chemical exposure. But nothing in our med kit could calm him. He bit clean through his tongue and nearly severed one of the corpsman's fingers. Carver restrained him, locking his wrist to the gurney. "We saw something out there," he said. "Something followed us." "What do you mean, followed you?" I asked. He didn't answer. That night, things got worse. Griffin started screaming in his rack. When we reached him, he was tearing at his arms with a broken toothbrush handle, trying to carve something into his skin. A word. Hollow. He kept repeating it over and over. "It's hollow. The world is hollow." They filled it with screams. That was when the lockdown started. Hadley sealed the forward compartments. Anyone who'd gone ashore was quarantined in the torpedo bay, with armed guards posted. But it didn't matter. Whatever they brought back, it was already moving. Seaman York disappeared during the 0200 watch. Just gone. His bunk was empty, but there was blood on the floor. Dried, black, and gritty, like charcoal. We found claw marks on the corridor walls between berthing and reactor control, like he'd tried to stop himself from being dragged. Then sickbay lost contact with the con. Power flickered. Emergency lights kicked in. I checked the diagnostics, no faults. The power grid hadn't failed, it was turned off. Someone was tampering with the breaker systems manually. Then someone, or something, started knocking on the sonar room hatch. 3 soft taps. Then 2 more, like code. I froze, staring at the sealed door. On the other side, I could hear breathing. Wet, erratic, like lungs full of water. I backed toward the equipment console, grabbed the emergency sidearm from the wall locker, and keyed in the emergency override. I wasn't opening the hatch, not without authorization, but I patched the hallway camera through. Nothing. Just an empty passage. Then the camera glitched. For a split second, there was something on screen. No, someone. Human shape, naked. Skin mottled with gray lesions. Pupils dilated black. Head tilted slightly to one side, listening. Then the image cut out. I locked the hatch manually. Somewhere down in engineering, alarms started going off. Radiation alerts, fire suppression deployment, containment breach signals. But it wasn't the reactor. The core was stable. I ran diagnostics again. Then it hit me. Someone had opened the airlock. I ran for the command deck. Emergency klaxons were howling through the corridors, and half the bulkheads were sealed. I passed Seaman Juno, sobbing in a corner with a fire axe clenched in her fists. She didn't even register me. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. The overhead lighting flickered as I reached control. I could hear the hissing of pressurized gas venting somewhere down the access shaft and the occasional deep groan of the hull flexing under stress it wasn't designed to handle. The red emergency lights cast long, shaky shadows over everything. It smelled like burned electronics and hot copper. Someone had tried to lock the command deck down, but the inner door hadn't seated fully. I forced it open with my shoulder and stumbled in. The room was in disarray. 2 of the consoles were dark, glass cracked. A coffee mug lay shattered near the foot of the navigation station, slowly leaking lukewarm sludge. Commander Hadley was slumped in the captain's chair, his lips pale, a tourniquet tight around his thigh. His uniform was soaked from the waist down with blood. He'd been bitten, badly. The lower half of his leg was wrapped in gauze, but I could already see the mottled discoloration spreading past the knee. His breathing was shallow. Near him, Chief Carver was hunched over the sonar console, typing rapidly with one hand while the other kept a pistol leveled at the main hatch. Carver didn't look up when I entered. He was muttering under his breath, mostly to himself, but loud enough that I could hear snatches. Ballast override. Torpedo tube 4 offline. Can't cycle the forward tanks. I grabbed the back of his chair and spun it toward me. "What the hell are you doing?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said you were sinking us. That's murder. That's all of us." Carver looked at me, and for the first time in hours I saw raw fear behind those eyes. This was a man who had served 20 years in the Navy, combat tours, deep-sea missions. He wasn't afraid of dying, but something on this boat, something behind those sealed hatches, had shaken him to the core. He gestured to the sonar screen. "You don't understand, Rourke," he said quietly. "There's something beneath us. I thought it was just interference, but it's moving. Slow, yes, but consistent. Too regular to be natural. Too deep to be a vessel. And it's not broadcasting. But it's pulsing like a beacon." I looked at the display, depth readout, 620 fathoms. That was the edge of crush depth for most civilian submersibles. We were running at 900 feet, not unusual for a Virginia class, still within operating limits, but it meant whatever was deeper was under serious pressure. And yet, it was there. Soft thumping on the scope, spaced 12 seconds apart. I checked the log. It had started exactly 39 minutes after Voss's seizure. Coincidence? Not likely. Carver continued before I could ask. "I think, whatever this is, it was dormant until the team brought it back. And now it's waking up." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Everything felt wrong, as if gravity itself was unstable. I could feel it in my inner ear, something pressing, not on the hull, but on my nerves. We were supposed to be the safest crew in the world, sealed, armed, trained for the worst. But this wasn't war. This was something deeper, older. Commander Hadley stirred, coughing wetly. His voice was cracked, but I leaned in as he forced words out. "You need to isolate reactor control. Seal aft compartments," he wheezed. "If the infection hits the coolant loop, we lose containment. There's a bleed in the backup scrubbers already." I blinked. That wasn't just damage control, that was endgame planning. If the reactor chamber was compromised and something like this, whatever this was, spread through the intake lines or crude systems, we wouldn't just die. The Colorado would become a rotting steel coffin venting contamination into the Pacific. "How long do we have?" I asked. Hadley closed his eyes. "Maybe 3 hours, maybe less." I stood up. My hands were shaking, but not from panic. I'd trained for pressure. I'd lived months in darkness, in silence, listening to the rhythm of machines. But nothing could have prepared me for this, the sense that our vessel, our safe haven, had already been breached from within. I turned to Carver. "Talk to me about crew locations. Who's still active?" Carver switched screens. 17 unaccounted for. 7 confirmed dead. Engineering team, galley crew, 2 from torpedo room. The 5 that went ashore are all showing symptoms. Griffins locked in dry stores. Kowalski. We think he's in shaft access, but we haven't been able to seal it off. York was last seen headed toward auxiliary life support. We've had no word since. 4 are still in command. Us, Juno, and Ensign Torres. If we count the automated systems as holding, we have control of the helm, reactor output, and the emergency ballast. But if we lose one more sector... He trailed off. The implication was clear. We'd spiral into critical failure. I opened the intercom panel. Static greeted me. I toggled to short range, then tried direct line to the forward compartment. This is Sonar Tech Rourke. Anyone still in forward battery, respond. Nothing. I toggled again. Juno, Torres, this is Rourke. Do not engage any crew that appears disoriented or violent. If you hear anything through the vents or hatches, do not open them. Secure yourselves and wait for direct orders. A burst of static, then faint breathing. Finally, a voice. This is Torres, came the shaky reply. I'm in reactor diagnostics. Something's wrong with the loop. It's whistling. I don't know how else to describe it, like wind through the pipes. And I saw, I think I saw Kowalski crawl out of the vent. He was bleeding from the eyes. He looked right at me and then kept going like I wasn't even there. Carver swore softly. I gripped the panel. Torres, seal yourself in. Override code Delta Charlie 01. Do not move until I confirm. We're going to try to restore manual control from command. The line went dead. I turned back to Carver. What's our best move? We can't surface again, not with that thing out there. We can't go deeper, not without risking hull breach. And if the infection's airborne through the circulation system, we're screwed either way. Carver exhaled slowly. There's one play left. We isolate. Shut down all internal air movement. Vent compartments, segment by segment. We lose power efficiency and crew comfort, but we buy time. Then we run the isolation scans on every heat source. Anything not where it's supposed to be, we purge, even if it's crew. I didn't argue. Morality had left the sub the moment Griffin carved himself open in the mess hall. This wasn't about saving everyone anymore. It was about stopping whatever had gotten in here from getting out. I accessed the ventilation control systems and began issuing commands to the environmental panel. Section by section, I cut airflow. Carver monitored sonar and heat. At 0510 hours, we initiated internal lockdown protocol, code Blackwater. It was normally reserved for radiation leak scenarios, but it was the only system that allowed for sequential compartment purge and hard seal. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't humane, but it was effective. We started at the aft. Engines, torpedo bay, auxiliary oxygen. Vents hissed, pressure equalized, and then we flushed. CO2 scrubbers ran hot. The heat signature from those sections dropped to nothing within 90 seconds. Then we hit midship. Something triggered a fault as soon as we started the purge. Pressure backflow in shaft 2, I called out. Someone's overriding the flow valves. Carver pulled the override lock. I'm locking the mechanical interlink. Wait, look. The display lit up with a new signature. Mid-compartment, moving fast, too fast. Deck 7, passageway B, I said. It was heading straight for us. Carver slammed the emergency lockdown. The hatch behind us began to seal, hydraulic arms groaning. I grabbed a rifle from the wall locker. We were down to seconds. Then we heard it. A skittering sound. Not footsteps, not boots, bare flesh on steel. It was fast, crawling, maybe even inverted. The lights dimmed again, and the hull groaned. then silence. No impact, no sound. But the hatch was still open an inch. I approached slowly, weapon raised. Carver aimed his sidearm over my shoulder. I pushed the door slightly with the barrel. Empty hallway. Then a blur. Something slammed against the opposite wall and then darted back into the shadows. For a second I saw it. What used to be Rourke. His skin was gray, mouth torn at the corners from screaming too wide. His eyes were glossy, like wet glass, and he moved like his joints had been unhinged and reassembled incorrectly. He didn't look at us. He looked past us, like he was tracking something deeper. Carver and I stared at the sealed hatch as the echo of his movement faded into the ship's steel bones. There was no immediate sound of return, no dragging, no breath, no footsteps, but the silence felt denser than before, like the pressure in the air had shifted, like the atmosphere aboard the Colorado had changed in some fundamental way. I leaned against the bulkhead, adjusting my grip on the rifle, my ears straining. Every creak of the hull, every distant metallic ping of cooling pipes became suspect. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Carver slid the deadbolt into place, the mechanism screeching as it seated. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. We both knew what we saw wasn't human anymore. Rourke was infected, but whatever had taken hold of him hadn't killed him. It had rebuilt him into something else, something faster, something designed to survive in this prison of steel and darkness. "We need to move forward," Carver said at last, scanning the compartment status monitor. Reactor loops still showing intermittent spikes. Torres may be in trouble. If containment breaks, we lose the only thing keeping the seawater on the outside. That was the priority now. Securing the reactor. Not for the crew, not for survival. For the ocean. For the world outside this submarine. Because if this thing got into the coolant system or found its way into the torpedo ejection tubes, it could reach open water. And from there, it would spread with the silence and speed only the sea could offer. We started moving forward through the command access corridor. The lights were down to emergency levels, low red strips along the floor, and flickering maintenance bulbs above that buzzed weakly. The pressure hull groaned again with the shift in current, and from somewhere above came the soft thump of something moving in the ductwork. It wasn't rats. There hadn't been any rats aboard when we left port. Each bulkhead we passed was sealed manually, weld lines still fresh. Someone had gone through a lot of effort to close these sections down. I saw the occasional blood smear on door frames and corner moldings, but no bodies. That was worse. I preferred the bodies. At least, with bodies, I could be sure they weren't moving. Torres had locked herself in reactor diagnostics, compartment 5A. We had to cut through 2 sealed hatches to reach her. Carver used a thermal torch from the damage control locker, slicing through the weld seams while I watched the rear, rifle up. I didn't trust the silence, even the sub's normal hum. The steady thrum of machinery, pumps, circulation fans, felt muted, like we were listening to a memory of the Colorado rather than the vessel itself. When we got the hatch open, we found a mess. The diagnostics room was trashed, screens cracked, wiring torn out like someone had been trying to rip the ship's nerves apart. But Torres was still alive, barely. She was crouched in the far corner behind a collapsed data rack, a fire extinguisher in her hands, her arms covered in bruises. She looked up when we entered, blinking like she hadn't seen light in hours. "I didn't let him in," she rasped, her voice dry and cracking. "He crawled out from the vent. He just fell out like water pouring from a pipe. I locked the door. I shut everything. But he said my name." She looked half mad, but she was alert, conscious, still thinking. Carver dropped to one knee beside her, checking her vitals with a small med scanner. No signs of fever, pupils reactive, no tremors, he said, then looked at me. She's clean, we take her. I hauled Torres up, one arm around her back as she steadied herself. She was shaking, but not from infection. From fear and something worse. He said my name, she repeated. He knew me. We didn't speak on that. From diagnostics, we could access the main coolant manifolds. Thick, braided steel conduits running from the reactor chamber to the heat exchange arrays along the sub's outer hull. The coolant system was what kept the reactor from turning the entire boat into a pressure-cooked tomb. If it was breached, or worse, if something used it to move undetected between compartments, we wouldn't stand a chance. I ran a thermal map scan. There was movement, slow, pulsing heat signatures just beneath the lower loop. Not coolant, not crew, something warm and alive, but not moving like a human. I tagged the signature and forwarded it to Carver's tablet. "Tell me that's a fault in the sensor," I said. "It's not," he answered. "Whatever that is, it's nesting." We couldn't run diagnostics from here. We'd need to access the primary controls and engineering. That meant going deeper into the sealed sections, back toward shaft access where we'd last seen Kowalski, and where York had run off. Torres insisted she was stable enough to go, and we couldn't spare a second escort. Carver nodded. "Three-man team. We move fast. We don't stop unless we see a survivor or we hear active breach alarms. You hear anything that speaks your name, don't answer it." The engineering deck had been partially sealed during the first outbreak. According to the system logs, the compartment hatches had been ordered shut from command, but the actual override came from someone on the deck itself. That meant someone, maybe several people, had survived long enough to try to contain it. We just didn't know if they succeeded. As we moved through the corridor, the smell changed. Less mechanical, more organic. Like rot, hot and old, like it had been stewing in a sealed room. There were handprints on the walls. Not just blood smears, actual prints. Some of them were upside down, as if someone had been crawling on the ceiling. My skin crawled at the sight. We hit the first breach about 30 meters in. The bulkhead had been forced open, not with tools, but with pressure. The seal looked like it had been pushed outward by something inside, and the metal was warped, twisted. Whatever was on the other side wanted out, badly. I took point. Carver followed with his sidearm raised, and Torres carried a utility axe from the emergency locker. The compartment beyond was pitch black. Lights were dead, and no system responded to power requests. I activated my helmet lamp, casting a narrow beam across the room. There were shapes, metal mostly, machinery, but also something else. Piles. Not random. Arranged. Bodies. They had been stacked in a circle, limbs intertwined, heads all facing inward. Most were crew, still in partial uniform. Some were stripped bare, others burned. A single flare was embedded in the center of the pile, long extinguished. Someone had made this deliberately. I approached slowly, fighting the nausea that crept up the back of my throat. There was something carved into the floor with a multi-tool. Dozens of words, overlapping, chaotic, etched with such force that the floor plating was buckled. One phrase stood out, repeated over and over between the chaos. "It waits below." "Behind me," Torres whispered. "This wasn't for us." Carver scanned the room. "Keep moving. We're not staying here." We passed into engineering through a manually cranked service door. The central control unit was still intact, dusty, some cracked glass, but operational. I accessed the reactor interface and initiated a coolant sweep. The system pinged several faults, mostly in secondary conduits. Then one alert caught my eye. Coolant contamination alert. Organic compound detected. specimen type, unknown. For a moment, I stared at the display, hoping it was a sensor misread, but the alarm was valid, authenticated at 3 separate junctions. Whatever was in the system was everywhere now, moving in closed-loop cycles through every major component on the sub. The reactor shielding, the auxiliary turbine generator, the life support heat exchangers, even the atmospheric reclaimers. The entire ship's internal ecosystem had been infiltrated. I expanded the data window and scanned the readouts. The organic trace was non-volatile, partially necrotic, high in intracellular protein chains consistent with advanced eukaryotic degradation. But there were no bacterial growth indicators, no signs of a fungal spread or viral RNA strands. It wasn't decomposing tissue in the traditional sense, it was suspended, preserved, but active. Something far more complex than any contagion I had studied. Torres leaned over my shoulder, still pale but lucid now that the reactor's hum had stabilized. She read the data, her face hardening with each line. "This isn't a biological contaminant," she muttered. "It's metabolizing, slowly, as if it doesn't need energy, just structure. It's not alive in any normal sense, it's colonizing the system." Carver glanced back toward the sealed hatch behind us. "How long until it reaches full system saturation?" I ran a progression model based on fluid velocity and internal temperature variation. The result wasn't encouraging. We're already there. The only reason we haven't lost total function is because the infection doesn't need to kill the reactor. It needs to use it. It's riding the thermals like a bloodstream. None of us spoke after that. The implications were obvious. This thing, whatever it was, had adapted to our environment. It didn't crash through hatches or consume flesh because it didn't need to. It infiltrated systems, moved through air, water, steel, and silence. And worst of all, it learned. Torres brought up the vent flow logs. She traced back a sharp spike in pressure that occurred 5 hours prior, the moment Voss had begun seizing. The air recycle system had registered a momentary reversal, like something had exhaled from deep inside the ship. That pulse, she said, didn't come from the reactor or the crew. It came from the auxiliary seawater intake line, a valve normally sealed during full submersion. Somehow, it had been opened for a duration of just 43 seconds. That's all it needed. I pulled up the manual override logs for that system. The request had been entered from a panel in the sonar room, my station, but I hadn't authorized it. For the first time, a sense of a true exposure crept under my skin. Someone, or something, had used my station to grant access to the heart of the boat. It didn't matter whether it was York, Kowalski, or one of the others now reduced to crawling, mindless husks. It meant that whatever we were dealing with understood our hierarchy, our systems, our protocols. It knew how to move without being noticed. Carver stepped back from the display, wiped his face with a trembling hand, and glanced at the emergency destruct panel embedded in the wall. Normally disabled outside of wartime, the destruct system could be engaged only with biometric authorization from the captain or 2 senior officers. Hadley was unconscious back in command. That left no viable chain of command unless we bypassed it manually. It was an option I didn't want to consider, but it was growing harder to ignore. As we debated our next steps, the lights flickered. A power ripple surged across the board, accompanied by a low, harmonic tone that wasn't coming from the speakers. It vibrated in the air itself, like a tuning fork pressed against the skull. The coolant pump began to oscillate, its rhythm subtly shifting from the programmed flow. Not erratic, not broken synchronized, synced to that pulse we'd first picked up on sonar, the same one still resonating from the ocean floor beneath us. Torres clutched her ears and dropped to a knee, her voice cracking. It's resonating through the ship. Every circuit, every panel. It's like it's tuning us, not destroying, synchronizing. I tried to stabilize the flow. Manual override failed. Then the screen glitched, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for me to see something impossible. There was a figure in the reflection behind me, framed in the dark glass. Not Carver, not Torres. It stood unnaturally still, its outline flickering like bad telemetry. The shape was human in proportion, but the proportions were wrong. Torso too long, joints misaligned. Its head tilted, not side to side, but in slow, vertical degrees, as if scanning for sound. When I spun around, there was nothing there, just the humming of the ship and the growing realization that nothing we were seeing was bound by the rules we understood. We had to make a choice. Stay and fight for a vessel that was already lost, or isolate and destroy the infection before it breached containment fully and found a way out. I looked at Carver, and he didn't flinch when I said the words, "We need to scuttle her." It took us 18 minutes to reach the main access to the automated destruct system. Along the way, we passed the bodies. Not dead, not alive. Suspended in compartments like they were on display, eyes open and locked in perpetual awareness. Some had their hands pressed to the glass, as if they had watched us approach and simply waited. Every step through the pressure hull felt heavier, not from fatigue, but from the presence that had nested within the ship. The Colorado no longer felt like a vessel. It felt like a host. We entered the destruct chamber through maintenance access. The keypad panel was dark. No response to touch, no diagnostic lights. That should have triggered concern, but Carver simply pulled the manual bypass lever and began unscrewing the override panel. He moved with purpose, no hesitation, every motion rehearsed like muscle memory. Torres rigged a makeshift data loop from the reactor terminal, her fingers trembling. We're bypassing both biometric locks, but once we start the countdown, we won't be able to abort. You understand that? I nodded, heart pounding. We're not coming back from this. When the panel opened, Carver slid in the final bypass fob and pressed both keys simultaneously. Warning. System override initiated. Manual self-destruct engaged. Countdown minus 20 minutes. The floor shook beneath us, just once. A single jolt as if something had shifted inside the very core of the boat. The lights overhead dimmed. From somewhere aft, we heard it, a moan, not vocal, not human. A groan of steel bending under pressure or of something vast and coiled, adjusting itself in the dark. We ran. Corridors blurred past. The temperature had begun to rise. The systems cycling into failure. The ship was heating, not just from reactor stress, but from something else. Like a fever building in a body trying to reject its sickness. We reached command with 6 minutes left on the clock. Commander Hadley was still alive, barely. His eyes opened as we approached and his lips moved. I leaned in close to hear. "You did it," he whispered. "Tell them. Don't go back down. Tell them." His eyes rolled back, and his pulse stopped. Torres closed them quietly. On the sonar screen, the pulse from the seafloor was gone, replaced by something else. Silence. Or retreat. I took the con one last time. We weren't surfacing, we weren't escaping. We were ending something that never should have begun. As the timer ticked down, I keyed a final log transmission. Burst data mode. Encrypted. Aimed at any Navy satellite that might still be functional. It contained everything. The logs, the sonar data, the biological findings, the full internal schematic of the infection's spread. Then I sealed it and sent it. 10 seconds. 9. I looked at Carver, at Torres. Neither spoke. We just closed our eyes. The Colorado groaned one final time, and then there was nothing. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.